Hey, I'm Zeta Sage Plays, and today we're going to be building the biggest habitat we've ever built on this channel. The Africa section of Bellemont Zoo that you can see here is going to gain a 12,000 square metre savanna for 5 different species. The enormous grey marker that you can see on the ground here is the size that the habitat's going to be. It's going to be absolutely huge. It's going to be called the Kenyan Rift Valley, and it's going to feature 5 of the species that live in that habitat. Let's get building. We'll start by turning this giant flat rectangle into something a bit more interesting, using the roughen tool to add some more contours into the ground, and then smoothing it off with the smooth tool and putting a little bit of a hill in as well. And then we'll move on to the first part of the build itself, which is a big faux rock mountain, which is going to sit towards the back of the habitat, draw the eye, look really impressive, and hide the animal stables, etc., which will be right at the back of the habitat, so we get a really natural looking savanna. The way that we're going to do that is to use pretty much just this one rock to build the entire mountain. It's got a great texture on it, and the shape tapers towards the top, which is really useful if you're trying to build a mountain. So we're just going to place it down, make sure random rotation is on, and use loads of them. Once we've got 3 or 4 of them in, we'll copy that 3 or 4, and then we can use this as a big chunk and then just start rotating this. And really quickly, we're going to have a big, impressive looking mountain that we can put towards the back of the habitat, and then we'll hide all these stables behind here. Once we've got the top of it done, we'll put a few different rocks in at the bottom to give it a base, and then we'll just start selecting big chunks of it and moving those around till we get the final shape that we want. And then we'll move the terrain up as well, just so the terrain goes up slightly as we get to the mountain. And then we'll move on to the fences. We're going to build what looks like a simple wooden fence to go around the habitat. We're going to build it on top of this wall piece, so it's on the grid, which means we can copy it around this huge area much easier. IRL, this would be made out of steel or some sort of metal and just painted to look like wood to keep some of the animals in, because we're going to have some big animals in here, and I should probably tell you what they're going to be. So there are 7 animals in Planet Zoo that live in the Kenyan Rift Valley, and we're going to have 5 of them in this habitat, including 3 animals that we've never had in a zoo before. We're going to have the blue wildebeest, which is one of the most requested animals on this channel, Thompson's gazelle, and the common warthog. And then you can't build a savanna without giraffes and zebra, so obviously we're going to have those as well. There's 2 more animals that we could have chosen, the common ostrich, and then the new Kirk's dik-dik, which we are definitely going to have in this zoo, but I've got some special plans for those which we will look at next week. In terms of the fences, I want to avoid straight lines as much as possible in this habitat, so we're going to create a little curved section here. And then the reason it's on the grid is so that we can now just do this, where we do want a vaguely straight line, and we'll have this going diagonally in towards the habitat, and then we can go back in and make some edits here and there so we don't have any particularly long areas of straight lines. Everything looks quite natural, you don't want it to look square. There's a little bit of tidying up to do where areas of fence meet, but if we zoom out here you can see that is the fence almost done already. There's a big straight line there, so we'll just cut that in half and just put each half of it at a slightly different angle to get rid of that. And then we'll take a look at one of the other things that's really important about this habitat, the sightlines. This is one of the viewpoints into our cheetah and rhino habitat, and you can see the savanna in the distance. And as we build, I want to make certain that we keep this sightline because it's going to look absolutely amazing from here when the savanna's finished. Speaking of guests, it's time to get the main viewing for the savanna itself built. So we're going to use the transport trick here to get a nice smooth path going up around the back of the cheetah and rhino habitat and down here. I want a pretty sizable viewing area here and a feeding point for the giraffes. Rarely see a giraffe habitat these days where you don't have the opportunity to feed them, so we want to get that in here. More on that later. And with the track done, that looks nice and smooth, not too steep, and we don't want it to be too high because we don't want to spoil that view that we just looked at. So we can get rid of this now, and that'll leave us with this terrain that we can work with, and then we'll use the flatten to surface tool to widen this out so we get a sizable raised area that we can put our paths on. Just smooth it out as well, and then we can start running the paths up here. Really enjoying using the natural paths for this Africa area because gaps in the path are no longer an issue. You can just use the sand tool to paint them in and they become invisible. Once we get to the top here, we're going to run the path down this side as well and then join them up so it's wider and we've got more room, and then we can put the last few pieces of fence in and start decorating. We'll take our African rock walls and use these to start decorating this end of the area, start making it sit in nicely with the rest of the area, and disguise this staff path that goes down towards the cheetah and rhino habitat there. We'll spin it round and place it at the base of itself, and that gives us a nice natural look to it. And then we'll build some fencing and railings going up into the giraffe viewing area. So we're going to use these new poles from the Zookeeper's Animal Pack along with the poles from the Grasslands Animal Pack to make just a simple metal fence that's going to go up these stairs and along the top of the viewing area and just make sure the guests are safe when they're up there feeding the giraffes. This would be a paid experience, so there wouldn't be too many people up here at once. And we've got a few tricks that we can do to make guests actually come up here so it looks like they're feeding the giraffes as well. We'll get onto those a bit later. For now, we're just going to perfect this fence. I really like these zookeeper metal poles. We've not had one like this where it's not a painted metal pole before, so that's really cool. And then we'll get onto the planting. We'll drop one of our little sections of forest onto this edge of the habitat where it comes in a bit. I can't recommend highly enough creating one really nice piece of forest for your zoo that you can just drop everywhere. It makes things so much easier. It's time for the terrain painting. So the main real-life inspiration for this habitat in terms of zoos are the savannahs at Prague Zoo and Zoo Leipzig, and we're going to replicate the way the terrain looks at Prague Zoo here. So there's big patches of lush grass, but then in between them is dirt and sand where the animals have worn the grass away. I presume it's replanted periodically. And I want to replicate that look here. So having covered everything in the short grass, we're then going to draw in some sand and dirt, and then we're going to place all of the buffalo grass. I don't know how many pieces I ended up using, but having put a few scattered pieces sunk down here, which is what I was seeing in Prague, we're now going to go around the entire edge of the habitat with these buffalo grass pieces. And then we're going to fill in the middle of the habitat with the buffalo grass pieces as well. Everywhere where you can see the grass texture is going to be covered in buffalo grass. It'll all be in one group. And once we have finally covered everything that we need to cover, we can just select it and drop it down a bit. And we're going to get this really realistic look and a beautiful contrast between the grass and the sand. Right, let's start turning this into a proper habitat. So firstly, we need an entrance, and I really like the dead logs going over the top of the path and the rocks that we created for the African leopard habitat. So I want to continue that here. So I've broken that up into chunks. I'm bringing that across here. Breaking it up means that we can make sure it's exactly the right size. And then I'm going to place that in such a way that it doesn't ruin this beautiful sightline here. It's intruding on the sightline a little bit too much for me here, so let's just move it back a little bit more. There we go, that's better. Let's finish off the entrance. So because it was designed for a different habitat, there's little bits of it like this, which don't exactly look perfect. We'll tidy that up with some of the creosote bushes. We're going to use loads of them to make one really sizable bit of foliage that's going to cover up the ends of the trees and things like that. That looks really nice. A few more arrowwood bushes as well, till this starts to look good. We'll get a nice sign on that later. And then we can move on to the animals' food and enrichment and things like that. We need a giraffe feeder next to the giraffe feeding point, of course, so we'll put that in here. We're going to cover the main body of this up with some of these big, thick Australia tree trunks to make it look more interesting, a little bit more natural, sit it in more, because that's going to be right next to the feeding point, as you can see. And then we're going to create some big sunshades based on the ones I saw at Prague Zoo, which are placed over all the feeding and water points for the animals, just to make sure the food and the water stays viable for longer and provide the animals with some shade while they're using them. These are really cute, very simple, so I'm going to drop some extra bits of thatch in here just to give them a bit more of a unique look. We've got one over this standard giraffe feeder here as well. I'm actually having an issue with the giraffe feeders in this habitat, i.e. the giraffes aren't using them. It's not because I've covered them up with these pieces, because it doesn't work if I just put the plain feeder in on its own as well. I'm assuming it's a bug at the moment, but let me know in the comments if you're getting that as well or not. It just seems to affect the giraffe habitats. Basically, the keepers just end up throwing the food on the floor for them instead. We've got 5 species in here, so we need lots of feeders, and we'll put some foliage in as well and keep checking that sight line. And then we're going to build a feeder for the medium-sized herbivores in here, i.e. the zebra, the wildebeest, and the Thompson's gazelle. This is again based on one I saw at Prague, but this is pretty generic. You see feeders like this in herbivore habitats all over the world. There's a nice little African flavour to this one, so I thought I'd use it. Just a simple thatch and log arrangement, and then we're going to use the European marquee beam and the grasslands animal pole to make the actual feeder itself. I'm going to put this on the workshop because I really like how it looks when it's finished, and like I say, it is super generic, so this works in pretty much any habitat with medium-sized herbivores in it. While I construct the metal framework where the food is going to go, let's talk about last week's habitat. So I got quite a few comments asking me what were the 9 species that were in the reptile house, and I realised I didn't actually show them all in the cinematics. So as well as the water monitor, caiman, axolotl, boa constrictor, and poison frogs that you saw in the cinematics, there was also the diamondback terrapin to the right of the caiman habitat, fire salamanders to the left, and then there was Goliath frogs in between the poison frogs as well. Back to this build, we're making the basic framework of it using the European marquee beam here. And now we've got one side of it done, we'll copy that and rotate that in the other direction so that we can get that sort of V shape that this kind of feeder has. And once we've got that in the right position, then we can move it under this shelter and start filling it with hay, or to be more precise, the dry common saltwort, which is absolutely perfect for this. So we use some of the larger ones here and just place them upside down, and then spin them around and just start copying them until we get a nice sort of bale of hay going on here. I know we've actually got hay bales in the game now, but they are really neat. They don't really look like it, how they look in these kind of feeders where they're suspended and the animals are nibbling away at them all day. And then we'll bury some in the ground as well and use that to make a kind of fallen straw underneath it, and just put loads of these around, especially under the legs of it. And then finally we'll add in the grassland pole for the kind of internal dividers that the animals put their heads in between to eat. And then we can move on to the final part of the build, which is the animal stables. We're going to do something we very rarely do here, which is build a building almost entirely on the grid. There's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, from the main guest viewing, this building is going to be completely obscured by this mountain, and it's not really going to be particularly visible from anywhere else in the zoo. And if something isn't particularly visible, the zoo doesn't tend to go crazy in terms of design because they don't want to spend money where it's not going to be seen. And secondly, basic buildings like this are exactly what the grid was designed for in the first place. So we're going to have some massive doors at the front so that the giraffes can get in. I love giraffe doors. Doesn't matter what the design of the building is. I always like seeing them. There's just something really appealing about doors that tall. And then we'll have some smaller doors next to it for the rest of the animals. And then we're going to turn these archways into actual doors. So we're going to use the animal door. And I realised after I placed it in, if we place it the other way up, it actually looks way better. So we're going to create a kind of divide in the door using the Grasslands animal pole, and then use some of these planter supports to make handles like we did in the reptile house last week. And we'll do that for all of the smaller doors. We can't use this exact piece for the giraffe doors though, they're too big. So we're just going to use some of the corrugated steel pieces, place those in, and then get them to the same colour as the animal doors that we've just used, and then hide the tops of the animal doors at the bottom for consistency. Then we'll put a basic roof in, just using the asphalt roof. Again, zoos aren't going to have any amazing roof design when the building can barely be seen. And then we're going to put some more forest in front of it, which will further hide it away. And we'll just end up with a fairly utilitarian basic building that would be the correct size for the giraffes. The other reason I don't want to do too much work on the outside is that we're going to do something sneaky with the inside, and the animals aren't ever actually going to go in there. We'll get to that in a second when we put the animals in, but firstly I just want to make sure that everything's looking nice before then. Now there's going to be various different viewpoints into the habitat down that edge of it you just saw there. One of those will be done today, and the rest of them will come in future episodes. And then I want to finish off the giraffe feeding point. So we put an animal talk point in, and once we assign an educator to it, that is going to get guests to actually come up here. And then we're going to cover it up with a habitat sign, which we just need to make a bit taller. Ignore the cheetah you can see on it, that'll be a giraffe when we're finished. And then we'll put some of the smallest display screens along here so we can have a sign for each of the species, and use some of our favourite piece, hinge number 1, to attach those to the fence. These are one of my favourite things about not being in franchise mode, the fact that we don't have to use the massive habitat signs everywhere. We can use these smaller display signs that look much more realistic. Alright, let's get into the building and get this habitat working. If you've ever tried to build a massive habitat like this in Planet Zoo, you'll know how hard it can be to get it working, so I'll show you exactly how I did it. We've got null barriers running right up to this building, and I'm actually going to put all the staff buildings inside the building, so the keepers have only got about 1 metre to walk until they're in the habitat. There'll be a little keeper gate in the side of this building. I'm going to have 2 keepers for the habitat. The important thing is to make sure that one of them is set to not clean the habitat, because with a habitat this size, they start cleaning it, and by the time they've finished, well, let's just say it needs cleaning again, and they end up stuck in a constant cycle of cleaning. So if you make sure one of the keepers doesn't do any cleaning, then when the one who is doing the cleaning finally finishes after about 3 months of in-game time and is exhausted and heads straight to the staff room to relax, you've got another keeper raring to go. He's going to go straight in there, fill all the feeders and water, make sure that none of the animals starve or dehydrate, and he won't be wasting any time cleaning. That's the habitat done. Let's check it out. It looks really gorgeous at sunlight here. Here's the entrance. I've themed it to fit in with the Baboon Rift, which is the other end of the Rift Valley in Ethiopia. And here's the habitat. It looks so amazing with all these animals in it. I've never had this many different species in one habitat before, and it's such a classic African vibe when you look at it. Those of you who've been asking for a blue wildebeest to be in one of my zoos for about 2 years now have finally got your wish. And the warthogs are great as well. They're so active, they're always running around the habitat. There will be more animals in here eventually. We'll be breeding all of the species in here to get more of them. If we get any more suitable animals in future that live in the Kenyan Rift Valley, we'll certainly add them into this habitat. Look how majestic the giraffes look here, walking away from the feeding point. You can see the guests up there as well. Here's one of our warthogs, trotting away across the plains. And we'll take a look at the stables building as well. One of our Thompson's gazelle walking towards it. Here is the sightline that I've been waiting for since we started building. It looks absolutely incredible with the rhinos in the foreground. And that's the Great Rift Valley, Kenya. Here's where we started today, and this is going to be a big difference. That is where we are now. The Africa section is getting really huge. but we've got a couple more habitats to put in there, starting with a really cool idea that we're going to do next week. Thanks to all of you who've joined the Explorers Club. Hit the join button on the channel if you want to join. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week. Bye.